Hey folks, how y'all doing? It's good to be together again today. We are finishing with the book of First Samuel, and man, look at how far we've gone through the Bible so far. We're at the end of March here, at the end of First Samuel, and we're getting into honestly some stuff, even here in this book and others that I'm just not as well acquainted with as I should be or want to be. So this is really cool stuff for me. And again, one of the things that I've really been consistently trying to challenge you and myself to do is to understand the big picture of the story and to be able to track through the different books of the Bible. So here's a challenge. If we had a list so far of all of the books that we've walked through, could you say something significant about how that book kind of contributes or speaks into the story that's being told throughout the Bible? Again, it's going to be difficult for us to know all of the details even as time goes on. There's always more depth we can drill down to into the particulars, but it's good for us to keep the story in mind. And here's something else that I just want to mention here along the way. There's been some interesting discussions lately. There was a magazine article about the potential shortcomings of our common devotional practices. In the kind of at least the evangelical world, we're kind of encouraged to have this quiet time where we do some Bible reading. Sometimes we use a devotional type of thing, and then of course have some time of prayer, and that's good. But the challenge kind of to that idea is that necessarily really helping us understand the Bible better? Now, we tend to often, again, not exclusively, in those times kind of sort of say, let me look at a verse, let me ask, what does God have for me? Kind of how does this speak into my life at this moment? And again, that's all valuable. But the challenge is if we don't understand this kind of big picture, important idea of context. And when I say context, I mean both, what's going on in a particular book of the Bible, and that kind of thing, not just, what does this verse say, but what's the bigger, argument, what's the situation that's going on in this. But also, I tend to agree with that concern that it doesn't necessarily help us to understand the big picture better. I think we can do both. We can do both things like what we're doing, which is more big picture, and then we can also do the more specific life application kind of stuff. But I want to suggest that having this big picture that what we're doing, what I'm focusing more on at least throughout this study. And I think taking 2 to 3 to 4 chapters a day means that we can't drill down on everything. We can't try to find the application in everything. Now, there may be, and that'd be great if there's, something in the day's reading that you kind of latch on to think about and wrestle with and maybe apply, in your own life. But we're doing too much too fast to kind of do a lot of that. This is not so much about how does this speak to my soul, I think, at least for me, and more, do I understand what's going on here? Do I actually understand the Bible and the big picture that is sort of being told here? So again, circle back around. Can we say something about the books of the Bible so far? And a good way to do this would simply be to take a piece of paper and write them down, and then write something next to each one. And probably a lot of you won't do that, but I want to challenge you that if you're like, I don't want to do that, well, do you know it? Because if you know in your head, that's great. You don't have to write it down. And again, no one's going to probably quiz you on this, and so it's not like you have to. But why not? Why not do a little bit more work to yield some fruit from what we're doing? So Genesis, of course, is the creation, right, of the world. of everything. We see the first man and woman, how things go wrong when they don't trust God. Then we fast forward. Of course, we see God's call of Abraham, and Abraham's family is going to become the primary vehicle through which God works throughout the biblical story, particularly in the Old Testament, but even flowing into the New. Of course, he calls Abraham, first Abram, to trust him, to follow him. God makes a covenant with him and with his children, right? So Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons become the rest of the book of Genesis. And we see, so the 12 tribes of Israel, right, are the kind of primary people in our story. And of course, we see other people getting involved in there, but that's the primary sort of group. In the book of Exodus, right, they went down to Egypt to survive, to get food. Joseph was there and his whole story. But in the book of Exodus, God's people are in trouble. They're under slavery. So God comes to Moses in the burning bush, right? And he tells him to lead his people out. And he does through this miraculous event of the Passover and the Exodus that becomes this anchor story for the biblical story, for God's people. God's bringing them out, right? They come to Mount Sinai. God gives them the covenant. And through this season, they're wrestling with God, right? In that. So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, God wants to dwell among them again. Remember, that was the intention back in the garden, back in Genesis. God's presence in the midst of his people. But for that to happen with the people's current reality, there's some things that needed to happen. And so that's the tabernacle situation and offerings and all that. And we have more of the law, the instruction, the guidance that we started in Exodus, right? So that's Leviticus. Numbers means in the wilderness. This is the wanderings of the people. They did not trust God to enter the land that he promised them initially through Abraham, right? And so they're in the wilderness wandering. God's providing through the manna, but there are constantly challenges with not trusting God, not believing God has the best for them. God's provision, God's forgiveness, this back and forth right through the book of Numbers. Deuteronomy, they're right on the edge of the promised land that they're going to go to, right? God called them out of Egypt, out of slavery, to go to the land that he promised way back to Abraham in Genesis, right? Deuteronomy. And so as they're on the edge of this, there's a bunch of things that they got to get right. And so this is kind of Moses' last stand. He dies there on the edge of the promised land. And then in the book of Joshua, finally we're in. And Joshua is the story of coming into and occupying the land and all of the challenges that are associated with that. The book of Judges was a darker time, right? There's no king yet, and people do what's right in their own eyes. So there's this pattern of not following God, oppression, calling out to God, God raising somebody up, delivering them, and the circle repeats throughout this time. During that time is situated the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth shows a couple things. One, what it looks like for a person to actually be faithful to God's way of life, and that's Boaz and what he does. So we see the application of some of the instruction we've seen before. We also see with Ruth, the Moabite, that people that aren't a part of Israel can become worshipers of God. We saw that with Rahab back in Joshua sort of as well too, right? So that's how the story's moving forward. Samuel stands at the bridge between the judges and the kings. He's a prophet. He serves in a priestly role. He serves in a judge role, and he anoints the first king. Remember, here in this book that we're in now, 1 Samuel, that we're just completing, God's people want a king, but Samuel's not pleased with that. And remember, God says that they're rejecting me as king, that God is the true king. But they want a king, they get one. They get Saul. Saul looks good at first, but he does not turn out to be good. And today, in today's reading, we're at the end of Saul's life. And remember, there's this overlap between Saul. Excuse me for a second. Got to plug in my cord before my laptop dies. There's this overlap between Saul and David. And so as we turn the page tomorrow to 2 Samuel, we are into David's really kind of heyday. David's been all through 1 Samuel as well too, but Samuel's been the one who's been the king David's going to get there. He's got some more challenges to go. We'll see that tomorrow as we start to turn the page. So again, can you tell the story is the challenge I want to give you. I would love for everybody, as they go on in their discipleship, their Christian life, etc., to be able to tell the story. Not just people like me, but people like you. You can do it if you want to. But if not, you maybe won't. So, all right, let me just talk about a couple things quick towards the end of 1 Samuel that we're in today, chapters 20-something, right? I think about 27 through the end, which is 31. And we're talking about in chapter 28, Saul in the medium of Endor. I think old school, maybe King James says witch. I'm not sure what that brings up in our minds. But this is a person who is kind of able to connect with the dead. So this is something that's not a good idea, but it works. So Saul even knows that this is not a good idea. He got rid of the people that he wanted them out. The people that did this kind of thing. This is not the type of practice that is given to us as a good idea. And so Saul, when he goes to this person, he hides him, disguises himself, and she knows she could get in trouble for sort of doing this. But it's interesting, and I'm not going to, I don't intend to necessarily spend the time wrestling with all of these different aspects. But it's fascinating that even though it's a bad idea, it is possible. So not everything is just a load of malarkey, to use a less profane word, the way that I tend to think it might be. It seems like, but still, just because something can be done doesn't mean something, or potentially doesn't mean something should be done. So be very careful with this. But what I'm interested in this episode in chapter 28 is this. We've not, and I've mentioned this a couple of times along the way, we've not seen very much at all so far about what happens after someone dies. Okay. It's just not, and what I've tried to kind of maybe emphasize in a way is that it's not, so far in the story, it's not all about make sure that you get your afterlife taken care of, right? Make sure you do certain things so that when you die, this is good and not that. Again, much more coming. I'm not trying to overstate anything here, but I'm trying to track with the story as it happens. Very, very, very embodied. This life, the hope is more for one's descendants, I think, than oneself. But we have, kind of mentions that don't mean much about like gathered to their fathers. What does that mean? It's kind of not really very well rooted. But so in this story, and ultimately it's about Saul being afraid, like he's been throughout his life, not trusting, that kind of thing. But he is able to communicate with Samuel after he's dead. So this is interesting. So dead is not just dead, right? There is something more going on. So I think what we're going to see as the story goes on is what is oftentimes called progressive revelation, perhaps, right? We understand more, or God reveals more, we understand more as the story goes on, right? So people at a certain point in the story didn't understand as much about God, about the whole big picture as we do as time goes on. Certainly in the New Testament era, with the teaching of Jesus and the apostles, etc., we know the most. We know what we need to know for ourselves, but they knew what they needed to know at that time. So Samuel is, let me just read a couple verses. Verse 13. The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a ghostly figure." And again, I've not looked into the Hebrew words for this and that kind of stuff at this point. I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth. So we're gonna see more of this idea of the kind of the underworld, if you will, this kind of Hebrew concept of kind of that there is some post-mortem reality, but again, it's not very specific or robust early on. And Samuel says to Saul down in verse 19. So he's still in this, in his current state, has prophetic ability to tell the future. So this is interesting. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the Philistines. That's their enemies. That's bad news for Saul. And tomorrow, you and your sons will be with me. So wherever Samuel is after death, basically what he's saying there is that Saul and his sons will die in the battle. They'll be defeated, which we see at the end of the book of 1 Samuel, but that they'll be with him. So again, no specific mention of like righteous, unrighteous, like how someone, there's not a distinction, I don't think yet, between different places that one could go. But there is, I think, a clue here, at least a substantial clue of post-mortem reality, some type of life beyond death. But again, it's kind of murky, I think. So what do you guys think about this? What does this, as you kind of think about this text, what does it say or not say to you in your thinking again thus far? Along the way. So I'm just going to note, that's one of those things I'm going to note. I have certain things in the back of my mind that I'm looking for, and I'm looking for when and where they come up. I just have a few different, things that I'm kind of trying to get a broad-based understanding as time goes on. I mentioned yesterday, women's kind of understanding of how they fit into the structure of the family and the ministry, and that kind of thing is one of the things I'm looking at. And I'm looking at how life after death sorts of things, resurrection when that comes up, how that kind of develops or develops maybe is the wrong word, how that becomes more revealed. Let's say that as time goes on. So that's that. And at the end of the story, very significant, of course, that we have. Saul and his sons, they're being in chapter 31 now. They are being defeated. Saul is injured critically, and his Saul knows he's going to die. He says in verse 4 to his armor bearer, kill me. Draw your sword and run me through, or these guys will abuse me. They'll do what they want with me, and they'll kill me whatever shameful way they want to do it. But his armor bearer was terrified. I think it's because he's the king. We'll see that as we flip the page tomorrow a little bit with another situation. So anyway, he won't do it. And so Saul falls on his sword. He takes his own life. And then the armor bearer does the same thing. So that's how this one ends. We're going to flip the page to 2 Samuel tomorrow. What are you guys' thoughts? What do you think about Saul? We're kind of leaving Saul behind here. Thoughts, comments, questions? Not had a lot of interaction recently. You guys dropping off? You leaving me? Or you just whatever? So let me know. I will see you guys later.